Daniel Dwyer 14, April 4th, 2047 AD. Father Dietrich loved Sundays. He loved giving sermons to his flock. He loved how they gave him money, but most of all, he loved that they brought their hapless children right to him and didn't object at all when he said that he had a need for them. They would service his every need, and he would watch them, bent over doing chores for him, and dream of what he'd like to do. He would talk to them in suggestive ways, gauging their responses, all the while trying to narrow down the ones he thought would be easiest to molest and keep silent. He didn't care if it was a boy or a girl. They were all God's children to him. He'd watched most of them ripen from mere babes, and though he had his preferences, he was content to pursue the easiest targets. He could imagine that someone else was blowing him if he wanted to anyway, as long as he got his dick sucked. He could picture a different child stifling their grunts and squeals as he fucks them in their ass if he so chose. As long as he got to fuck one of them, he would be happy. Of course, being a man of God, he felt that he had to justify such an act, so he waited until the right things happened at the right time, and then he attempted to live out his fantasies, fully justified of his acts in his own twisted mind, thinking it suitable punishment for a certain young sinner. Luckily, he was being watched from the shadows by an invisible presence, observing him through his own eyes. Luckily, a benevolent presence was there to intervene when the man of God made his move. Maybe there was a God after all. Agatha was helping him for the day, dusting his office. She never understood why he always wanted the underside of his desk dusted, not for a moment suspecting that he asked her to do it so that he could watch her move back and forth on her hands and knees, bent under his desk, and imagine himself violating her. She never suspected that it was fuel for his fantasies. Whilst hip-deep under his desk, Father Dietrich, watching her from behind, said, "So, I hear that you have been showing your breast to some of the boys." She stopped cleaning and backed out from under the desk. She was 12 years old. She looked up at him from down on her knees and said, "Only one." He scoffed and threw his hands up. "Only one?" he repeated. "If it's one, it might as well be 1,000, Agatha. What have you done in repentance?" "I asked for forgiveness in prayer," she said, dumbstruck that they were suddenly having this conversation, caught completely off guard. "Well, do you think that's enough?" he asked, arms folded across his chest. "I don't know what else I can do," she said. "I thought that asking for forgiveness was enough. Oh, God." "You may be damned, child," he said. "Premarital sexual activity is serious. You might burn in hell for this. I have to think. I have to pray." She almost started crying, but she held it together. He took a little time to pretend to think as he stood there with his eyes closed. Then she said, "What should I do?" He opened his eyes and looked down at her, seeing the desperation in her naive young face. He began to pace the floor in front of her and said, "You are married to Jesus Christ, child. I married you to him myself. I think you have to make amends to the man you married. You may have to serve him to show your devotion, to show him that you will from now on uphold the vows you made to him. Don't get up." She was starting to motion like she was going to stand, and he stopped her. He liked how she looked on her knees, and it was convenient for her to already be at the right height to suck his cock. She stopped her upward motion and rested on her knees instead, not the least bit suspicious of where this was headed, inexperienced and trusting as she was. "How are you going to do that, He looked at her, concealing his arousal well, his robes hiding his erect penis. "How are you going to make amends for engaging in sexual congress with another man? How do you demonstrate to Jesus that you are only for him until you marry another?" "I don't know," she said. "Well, if you don't want your immortal soul to burn in hell, we will have to think of something," he said. He paused only briefly and said, "Wait, I think I know a way, but no." He turned his back to her and she started to cry, panic setting in as her fragile picture of reality was crumbling. "What?" she pleaded. "What can I do?" He turned back to face her, seeing tears running down her cheeks, and he said, "Well, I am your path to Jesus, the closest you can get to him. Servicing me in the name of Jesus would be a suitable penance. Perhaps then he could forgive you. If he doesn't forgive you after the first time you receive our holy seed, then maybe he will eventually. I can think of no other way to save you from damnation." She paused only for a moment and then asked, What should I do? He pretended to pray and convene with God, and then he opened his eyes and said, Well, we should start with that which most compares to your offense. He sat in his desk chair and adjusted the height so that the seat was lower. I think you should show me your breasts, and perhaps that I should feel them in the way a husband does. But I never let Andy touch my boobs, I just let him see them, she said. That is not the story I heard, Agatha, he said. I hope you don't think that lying about it is going to prove fruitful. A husband punishes wives who lie. She paused. She had let Andy touch her breasts through her shirt, but she nonetheless had. She was lying. She nodded at Father Dietrich and said, You're right, I'm sorry. And she promptly lifted her shirt up over her head and removed her bra. He watched her and pretended to contemplate for a second. He then rubbed her breast for a few seconds, and then he said, as he pulled back his robe to reveal his penis, All right, for lying on top of everything, you are really going to have to show me how sorry you are. Come over here, my holy seed awaits you. As you dine on it, it will be as though you have dined on the divine flesh. She scooted closer to him, and he grabbed the back of her head and pushed her face down and moved it around to where her mouth was rubbing on his penis. Open your mouth and stick out your tongue, he said. She obliged, and he rubbed his dick up and down her lips and tongue. The look of shock was still fresh in her eyes. Then he said, Okay, open up. See how much of it you can fit in your mouth. Think of it like a popsicle. When she did, she got her first taste of cum from the excretions that were already pooling at the tip of his penis, and she immediately withdrew. She started bawling, and he bent down and rubbed her shoulder. He said, That's okay. Try again. And he leaned back and again guided her head down to his lap. This time, a couple of inches of it actually went past her lips, and he could feel the sweet of her tongue against it. She tried her best to satisfy him, but she could only fit a small portion of it in her mouth, and she kept gagging and recoiling, apologizing to him every time. Frustrated, Father Dietrich finally stood and said, Fine, I can give you my seed another way. Take off your pants and bend over the desk. What are you going to do? She asked, already taking her pants down. Vaginal sex is sacred, Agatha, and must be saved for birthing children. You are not going to like it very much, but I'm going to deliver my seed in your rectum. It will only hurt for a while, but you should be punished for ineffectively harvesting my seed with your mouth like I asked you to. So, since you failed to suck my seed out sweetly, I shall now punish you with it, he said, grabbing her by the waist and turning her around even before she had her pants all the way off. I'm sorry, it was my first time. I can do better, she said, worry setting in as he bent her over. He spit on his hand and rubbed the spittle around her butthole and said, Remember this punishment for next time, the consequences of not swallowing my seed. Then he started to put it in. It hurt a lot, and she reactively tried to pull away. Father Dietrich tightened his grip on her waist and pulled her back toward him, pushing it deeper and deeper. Ow! She yelled and tried desperately to pull away. Stop! I'll suck it better, I promise. Just give me a chance. Ow! Stop! There was no chance of him stopping. He wanted to go balls deep into a hole. Her ass felt really good to him, and her mouth just wasn't cutting it. He wasn't taking it back out until he was finished. He violently arrested her attempts to resist him, pinning one of her arms behind her back and holding it down hard, started to shove it in deeper, and said, This is for your own good. If you do not serve your penance, you will be damned. Don't you care about your immortal He was cut off as a hand closed around his throat. One would have liked to think that Daniel would have intervened well before this point, but it was at that moment that the sex became non-consensual. It was at that moment that Daniel interpreted the mutual perspectives of Agatha and Father Dietrich and concluded that he was raping her. So it was at that moment that he interfered. The godly man released his clutch on Agatha, who instantly pulled away. There was blood on the end of his penis, which flicked through the air as it came out of her ass. Her blood. Agatha would not confess to the rape until after this was discovered by investigators, who then filed it away as another unsolvable case attributed to the spirit, as probable cause for a spirit-style act of vigilantism had been identified. Daniel lifted the overweight man up by his throat. The weight of his body alone could have been enough to kill him, being suspended the way he was, but his neck miraculously did not break as the dark shadow held him up high. Then the shadow looked into its 8-ball, its fingers hardly distinguishable anymore, as if the ball itself had almost completely enveloped his hand. Agatha looked up in astonishment, slowly covering herself up, entranced by the actual presence of the actual spirit, suddenly calling into question everything she'd ever been taught to believe. Father Dietrich dangled in the air, unable to relieve any of the stress on his neck because he could not touch the spirit. His hands just went right through the shadow like it wasn't there. Daniel promptly carried the godly man over to the wall and pinned him against it, right up against a golden cross which dug into his back. Then he looked into his 8-ball. He laid his right arm, the arm holding the ball, across the robed man's chest. Then he folded him in half, bringing his head down to his pelvis, completely severing his spine, bending him like a sheet over his outstretched right arm, and squarely placing his dick right in his own face. Then he looked into his 8-ball, dropped the body, and disappeared, collapsing into his own shadow. Agatha started to pray, and then she realized what she was doing and stopped. She was praying to the wrong God. She always had been. So she started again, only this time she prayed to her new God, the one that had saved her, the one that had administered righteous justice without the interplay of man, uncorrupted by the temptations that afflict mortals, the Spirit. Her parents threw a fit when she was implicated in the death of Father Dietrich. She had fled the scene without telling anyone what had happened, and her parents were none too sympathetic when it was discovered that she was being raped, and blamed her for his death regardless. They knew that he had raped their daughter, but because he was their priest and he was dead, they chose to honor him, and told Agatha that if she had never done anything to warrant him doing what he did, which they were sure was an exaggeration, that he would still be alive. Agatha started working and got legally emancipated from her parents at the age of 15 and never looked back. As soon as she was free from her parents' punitive ways, she joined the Society of the Spirit. She became a strong voice among Daniel Dwyer's early supporters and was very vocal about her interpretation that he was in fact God. There were many attempts on her life during the start of Daniel's worldwide invasion, all thwarted by Daniel, some actively averted very intentionally in view of the public to further instill in the minds of the people comprehension of the effectiveness of his power. The only time in her life that she would ever doubt the glory of Daniel Dwyer was when he selected her to birth a child. At first, she was honored. She had always wanted to be a mother. But when the cold realization set in that she would not raise her child, that Daniel would instead raise her child, she for a moment resented him. Once her postpartum depression passed, she felt better, and just a few months after she was no longer ordered to provide breast milk, she felt like her old self again. Except she felt lonely. She had a child out there somewhere, but she would likely die never having met him or her, and even worse, she wouldn't recognize them even if she did meet them. She'd made a living singing praise to the Spirit. It had been her job to worship Daniel Dwyer, but sometimes she wondered if she was fighting on the wrong side. She would never publicly renounce Daniel Dwyer, but she did try to, on her deathbed. Unfortunately, Daniel intervened to stop her. He stifled her last words as she lay dying, and no one was the wiser. She would die a celebrated Dwyerist, even though she had intended to renounce his name and leave a legacy more harmonious with how she actually felt. Daniel couldn't let that happen. The revolution had just begun. He couldn't let the words of one person potentially destabilize the structure he was forging. So, she died a few minutes early, asphyxiated in her bed. She couldn't move to fight him. No one suspected that he'd just forced her to hold her breath until she suffocated, but he could not let the words she so desperately wanted to say come out of her mouth, and she refused to back down. If she'd been allowed, she'd have cursed his name. Daniel Dwyer murdered her on camera, in front of thousands of viewers, and no one suspected that anything was amiss at all. They all assumed that the last breath of the world-famous Dwyerist Agatha Downey was the one that they'd witnessed. There was no indication that she still had at least one more breath left in her, or that it was stolen from her by her once chosen God, the God that saved and killed as he willed. Leilin 4.3, June 7th, 1178 BC. She was quick, effective, precise, a perfect killer. She did not kill with malice in her heart usually. She was, with every kill, simply selecting the lesser of two evils, making the world right again in her eyes. Her every act was justified in her mind. The murder of infants and children, pregnant women, she felt only as much guilt over their deaths as she did over those of armed men. Their deaths were for a purpose, to ensure the annihilation of the demon, and she would stop at nothing. She was entirely sympathetic to most of those she had to kill, but could not allow for her feelings to get in the way of her mission, and killed her targets as intended, with no exceptions and no hesitation. Babylon was not the thriving Mecca that it once was, having already had to recover from war and other slights since its glorious days of old, but it was still heavily populated, particularly in comparison to the Mediterranean cities of the time that were failing to thrive as a whole. The European world was already on the verge of collapse. The tin trade out of the Middle East was still very much available to the Western consumer, but with the failure of crops season after season throughout Southern Europe, less and less trade for tin was taking place. The collapse of agriculture meant that funds normally generated through trade within the Hittite Empire and Southern European states came to a veritable standstill. Having less and less to offer in trade with the Babylonians, less and less tin necessary for the casting of bronze flowed west of the Middle East. You cannot trade if you have nothing to trade with. Economic collapse was already taking a foothold, and when the Elamite king burned Babylon again, 20 years from the time of the forthcoming of Lialan, it with finality caused the end of what historians will later refer to as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Even in Greece, where history had been actively recorded for centuries, little is known about the resulting period in history. The record-keeping just stops dead in its tracks for decades upon decades. It would not be until the forging and use of iron becomes commonplace well into the next century that signs of recovery would begin for this part of the world and the Iron Age would begin. These were the kinds of instrumental moments in history Lialan looked for, and was so adept at ensuring come to fruition or become averted as needed. Hemhut listened from the shadow of a stooping hillside, hundreds of yards from the city walls, as her little feet walked through the streets of the city. He heard her as she slipped right into people's homes, quietly and quickly killed someone or another, wasting no time at all, never being taken notice of, and then moving on to the next, completely and utterly without fear. Lialan was the very definition of fearlessness. He never thought in his life that he would see the day that she was afraid of anything. But he had never seen anyone so afraid, so terrified as she had been when she'd met the demon. He never imagined that fear would be an emotion his Lialan would ever experience, given her powers and her knowledge of his fierce willingness to defend her, but she knew it deeply now. She feared the demon as none have ever feared anything before and none will after, knowing him so intimately, having peered into possible futures along so many trajectories to find them all ravaged by it, by him, and having lived them all out in her mind in the hopes of finding some way to combat him, and finding only one. Of the practically infinite possible futures she was privy to, she found that there was only one remaining that led to his eventual destruction. That in itself was terrifying enough, a strong indication of how ravenous and powerful the demon really was. It was no wonder the lengths she was willing to go in order to control the future. If she were to miss even the slightest detail, the strings would be cut, and no future timeline would remain but those destined to be devoured by the demon. She was perhaps even more driven to kill the demon than she had been to create her lost utopia, and she had in the beginning been utterly obsessed with crafting their once future kingdom. She, in hunting the demon, was resolute and acted with purpose, without second-guessing herself as she had on the path to perfection. She acted without doubt. She returned, not a drop of blood or a mark of any kind on her person, and Hemhut admired her. She did not look like Lialan, just as she hadn't the last two times, but it was her. She was different, but the same. She was his eternal love. She motioned for him to lift her, and she climbed the rest of the way onto his shoulder, and she pointed and said, "On to Elam, my love, that way." He walked in the direction his love had bid him, and he asked her, "Can you live any longer this time, Lialan?" "Not by much," she said. "There is nothing to be done for it, my love. The demon is forever searching for me, casting his gaze around the world. The instant he looks through my eyes, I am as good as dead." He will find me in just over 3 weeks, and I have to die before he finds me. Again. She threw him a stare, still scorned by his involvement in forging their new fate. He did not respond. He either did not know that she was glaring at him, or he pretended not to notice. She loved and adored Hemhut, and would never pretend for a moment that she didn't, but that didn't mean that she couldn't feel hurt and be upset with him. He already felt bad enough for what had happened. She didn't feel the need to deepen his wound, but she couldn't help but feel sore about it, especially now that the topic had come up. After a long, uneasy pause, Hemhut, eyes never flinching from their forward stare, never looking up to see her face, said, "Yes, my love." She couldn't stay mad at him for long. After all, if she hadn't decided to play God, none of this would have ever happened in the first place. It was in no way his fault. She was going to have to fight this entity, this demon, regardless of that which anyone anywhere ever did or ever does. She just wished that she had instilled in her giant much earlier the critical need to follow her word, let her do what is needed, and most of all to not interfere or impede her on her path. Because he did not listen, because he had not been completely obedient, because he had forcefully detained her, she had been stripped of any options she may once have had, better options to defeat the entity. Now she would have not only to devote nearly her every moment to pursuing the demon, but she now also had to cut short even her final life, and in it die with the demon. But at least Hemhut would be safe. That was all she cared about anymore. She would not live forever, no matter what happened, but the demon and Hemhut would. If she did not set her mind on destroying the demon, her love would remain a prisoner forever. The world would never be safe for him if the demon lived, and he would have to remain in hiding indefinitely. Thus, her quest was simple. Eliminate the demon Daniel Dwyer at any and all costs. They spoke, traversing the days she had remaining, and she tried her best to tell him what to expect, careful never to say anything to him that would be of consequence to her plan. After they'd arrived at Elam and the deeds were done, she rejoined him in the wilds and spent the last few of her remaining days with him. They tried to enjoy one another's company and rejoice in that for which they could say they were thankful, but the pauses were long and the silences uncomfortable. With tears in her eyes, she bid him walk away, and then, once he was a sufficient distance away, she said to him from a distance at which only he could hear, "Until next we meet, farewell, my love." And then she went to her knees and swiftly smashed her forehead against a jagged wall of rock, caving in her skull and exposing her brain. She was dead in seconds. Hemhut did not stop walking, but when he heard the sound of her death, his face involuntarily shrunk and squeezed into a sorrowful grimace, and he quietly moaned, and he wanted to cry, and he shook his head and covered his ears with his hands as if he were trying to unhear the noise. Had he been able to cry, tears would have been streaming down his cheeks, but he could not, no matter how much he was hurting. The last of his tears were already spent, and had been long ago. All he could do was strengthen his resolve to follow the word of his love, a small penance. It was now dawning on him just how little time he would actually have to spend with her throughout the coming ages, and how much time he would spend without her, waiting for her, alone. He was deeply, deeply sad, and as the centuries passed without her, that sadness began to harden, solidify into hatred for the demon, the unborn being that had cost them so much, and he too became resolute in Lyelin's quest to subvert him. Hemhut had never hated anyone before. Hating Daniel Dwyer was a unique experience for him, and his hatred for the demon would, in time, grow to rival his passion for Lyelin, so much so that eventually the scales would tip, and he would do something very, very foolish, and ultimately fulfill his destiny.